It somehow got on this angle to hit the water, but the pilot managed to accelerate fast enough where the drone half dunked in the water but still flew out of it. So the drone survived. It then landed. It was never the same again. The camera didn't really work properly and the gimbals didn't work either, but the props and the engine, it was fine for it to land. Hello, welcome to the show. I'm Harry Macpherson-Wood, and on today's show we're going to be diving into some UAV moments, particularly in relation to wildlife. What we're going to do is share some experiences myself and the team have had with drones and incidents that we've had with wildlife. So the first story, it's probably unlikely going to happen to you, but we had this job where we were doing a survey, a 3D model of a particular area, and there was a large dam that we were flying over to then create this 3D model just next to it. So this pilot, he was completing a job, and as he'd finished the job, he decided to, rather than letting the drone fly home automatically, that he would fly it home himself. And in doing so, he chose to fly over this dam at a very low height, roughly a few meters above the dam and the water. And as he was on his way back, there was a large group of ducks just floating in the water or sitting in the water, and they became a little bit disturbed by the noise of this drone. So what they did was all start to fly away, and as they were flying away, one of them flew into this approaching drone. And obviously it didn't end very well. The drone hit the duck. It then turned somehow to then fall into the water, and the duck itself flew away. It was fine, but this drone wasn't. And what it did, it somehow got on this angle to hit the water, but the pilot managed to accelerate fast enough where the drone half dunked in the water but still flew out of it. So the drone survived. It then landed. It was never the same again. The camera didn't really work properly and the gimbals didn't work either, but the props and the engine, it was fine for it to land. So interesting story. Really, the recommendation is when flying back to your home point, don't fly really low to the water. Anything can happen, and in this situation it was ducks. But yeah, interesting story. The second one is probably the more likely scenario. What might happen for you pilots flying, particularly surveyors when they're doing mapping or modeling, is when they're completing their grid. There's wildlife floating around the area, and these may be birds of prey, and see this drone as a threat. So in some situations, when they see this as a threat, what they want to do is take it out. Speaking from our experiences, the likelihood of that is very low. We've only had a very small amount of incidents where birds of prey actually strike or swoop for these drones, and a very rare, or even rare or less likely, that the birds will take out and actually take out and crash the drone because if they've swooped it and hit it. But it has happened. We've had a scenario where, as we were doing a surveying mission, the drone was doing its loops. This drone that we had was a DJI Matrice 210. So quite a large drone. I think it's rated around that 8 kilograms in weight. and a bird of prey swooped it, attacked it, hit it, and took it down. And down it went. It crashed and basically exploded, pieces everywhere. And yeah, it was not recoverable. It was a goner. Luckily, as we are a REOC holder with CASA, we did have insurance, so we were able to claim that on insurance and get the drone replaced. But definitely a good learning situation for us that birds of prey can attack, and they do attack, and they can take down your drone, even the larger ones, which is probably more surprising that they can still attack such a large drone and take it down too. So, based on these two events, can we avoid hitting or avoid wildlife from attacking us? The answer is can't guarantee it, but you can minimize it. From our experience, what we've noticed when wildlife appear threatened, what they start to do is fly directly above your drone and circle it, so you can tell that they're watching it. And more likely, what they will do is swoop down and just fly above it to try and intimidate it or scare it. And sometimes what they might do is actually swoop down and hit it, which is the less likely scenario. We've had on many occasions birds come swoop and miss it just to try and scare the drone. But on the one or two occasions we've had, the birds actually strike the drone and crash it. So yeah, if ways to minimize a bird striking it, if you see them circling around directly above your drone, what we would do in that situation is either wait to see if they do appear threatened by it and want to strike down. As soon as they make that first swoop, then we'll cancel the flight and delay it for another time. Or sometimes we know where the birds are more likely to be. Those birds of prey are more likely to be on sites. For example, we do quite a few landfill sites for volumetric calculations, and because there's just a high amount of rubbish and lots of wildlife that feed off this rubbish, birds of prey, quite a lot of them float around in this area too, because they can then, there's just more food for them. So these landfill sites we know to be extra careful of, because there are those birds of prey floating around and are interested and threatened by our drone when we are flying. Another way we can minimize the impact of wildlife striking is, what we've found is, if you choose a day that's where visibility or wind is not ideal. So you might pick slightly windy day, certainly not outside the limits of what your UAV can handle. Or if you pick visibility that's maybe a little bit foggy, we tend to find that the birds are a lot less likely to be around, and which is great for us because we can then complete the flight and not have anyone circling around us or potentially swooping or colliding with us. So that's what we do. If we have sites at landfills in particular, we'll pick the more foggy or windy days, or the potential chance of maybe a little bit of rain here and there. They're perfect days to do the flying because we tend to see less wildlife floating around. And as often required by the EPA, these volumetric surveys at these landfills are done towards June. It's one of their reporting periods. So it's quite easy to pick a day where it's more likely to be foggy or the lower cloud or lower visibility areas. Still fine for us to visibly spot our drone, but there's just that lower cloud that appears to, or what we've found, we don't see as much wildlife floating around then, and less birds of prey. So if a bird strikes or is beginning to strike your drone, what's the best way to get out of there? What we're finding is if that first strike does occur, the pilot immediately takes control of the drone and accelerates vertically upwards, because when a bird of prey is going to strike, it'll circle, and obviously when they're circling, they look straight down at what they're going to attack. So if we're vertically climbing up to the point where we're at the same height as them or higher than them, then they aren't going to be with us because they're looking straight down. So what they'll want to do is climb up to be above us or get out of there and retreat back to their nest or the trees nearby. So that's what we would do, and then immediately land back at our home point. We haven't had any situation yet where when that has happened, we've immediately flown back to the site and had to, on our way back, a bird strike us and collide us. It's been during those missions where we're slowly doing that grid up and back, allowing the bird the time to circle around us and decide that we are a threat and attack us. So our last UAV moment is probably more a word of advice. I was at a conference in Canberra in 2023, and in the conference there was a speaker that came up that was from Vic Forest, and they completed a study on if they were able to spot flying possums within the forestry of the area that they were cutting down. What they had to do was prove that there was a low amount or a certain ratio of these possums in this forest that they were cutting down, and if they could see them, then they had to relocate them. And while the study found that they can use drones to find these possums, I think from what they suggested, there was only one or two that they did find during this flight. But the more interesting fact that we got out of this is that when they were flying roughly 20 meters above the tree line of this forest. And when they found these possums, they appeared to be undisturbed or didn't really care that this drone was there. And this UAV or drone, it was a Macpherson 300, so it's quite a large drone, and it is quite a noisy, and they wouldn't know that it was there, but appeared to be undisturbed from it. And that's what they noticed with their studies too, that it was one thing that they mentioned, that they didn't really appear shocked that this drone was floating around, taking videos of them. So it's really good evidence for us as pilots when we're completing jobs in national parks or forests, just to consider or to make sure that we're considering wildlife when doing these flights, that we're not impacting them or trying to minimize our impact with the wildlife. So we're using this study as a bit of a guide for us, that the general rule with populous areas, if you're flying outside 30 meters horizontally from any person, you're meeting CASA's regulations. We're applying this to wildlife as well. If we complete jobs for national parks, what we will do in our risk matrix is have a column there specifically stating that we will maintain that 30-meter buffer both horizontally and vertically from vegetation, because if there are wildlife within the vegetation of these trees, what we're doing is keeping that buffer to minimize our impact on harming them or disturbing the wildlife within these areas. So that's one piece of advice that we're using, that we're finding works well when we're flying for national parks or flying for jobs within national parks. It's a great risk mitigator or consideration when applying to these national parks which might be Parks Victoria or New South Wales National Parks. So there you have it. That's us as a UAV team. Us sharing some of our moments that we've experienced during our flying over the years. If you have any similar experiences or would like to share anything else, please leave a comment below. Otherwise, thanks for tuning in and we'll see you next time.